It's really a privilege to introduce James. James is one of the finest minds and heart I have seen. You know, the stories which I've heard about your big heart goes much farther than the stories I've heard about your big mind. He's written few books. About the first one was Information
Consciousness, Reality.
Information, Conscious and Reality. He's a mathematician, he's a physicist, he's a psychonaut, and he dabbled into the structures of reality, but from all perspective, and only few people have seen who can go from a physics perspective of reality to mathematics perspective of reality to psychedelics perspective of reality to shamanistic perspective of reality and do justice to that. Very, very rare combination. He recently published his book. Is it published or it's written?
It's still hanging with the publisher. Next 4 months, 6 months. Let's see.
Right.
That shouldn't be too long.
It's called Sapiens Cosmos. He gave me a version. I'm reading it these days, and like yesterday it was 12:30 in the night, and I really wanted to continue more. Like, no, I should be sleeping. Yes, so it's really so beautifully written, just like a genius who has written this book. He just had a TED talk in Ibiza on the topic. So what we have decided is, since he has really worked on this topic, let's have to listen some version of that TED talk for around, let's say, 30-40 minutes, and then we come up into a question and answers round. I'll do some moderation around that, and then
Thank you so much for your kind words. Very kind. Hi everyone, thanks for coming. And to sort of try and answer what consciousness is, let me start by going back 300 years. So that's when we kind of started to understand reality using mathematics. So this was kind of very unexpected, because why should something we think about in our minds actually describe the structure of the universe? And 300 years ago this started, and we had classical physics, which allowed us to understand how the stars move, how electricity works, and that seemed to be like really clear. So the universe is simple, it's like this clockwork, you can just understand it by looking at its tiny parts. And this is where kind of a big, let's say, philosophical flaw happened, that implicitly we thought that, well, the metaphysics, kind of the thing behind the physics, the thing you can't kind of prove or disprove, but kind of which tells you what it is, because physics just tells you how it works, but the thing that tells you what it is, we assumed it's like this materialistic and reductionistic worldview. So if we zoom in, we find these little pieces of Lego, and if you put them together, we get the world and complexity and consciousness. And this thinking kind of like never got challenged or realized that this is actually not a part of science, but actually already philosophy. So that kind of started. So the good news is, 300 years ago, we discovered the machine code of reality, mathematics. And the bad news is that we started with a metaphysical assumption which turns out to be problematic. So everything was fine until 1905, because then we stumbled upon the quantum world. No one saw this coming. This was like a big surprise to the physicist. Actually, Max Planck, the person who first saw this, he just had it in his equations because some measurements didn't match up, and he just thought, oh, I'll do this little trick. And then the measurements work, but no one thought that this was actually a part of reality, that energy comes in little packets, quantum packets, it's discrete. So everything around us is like a continuum, like waves in a pond, but somehow this quantum world is like little discrete packets. This is super weird. And then 1905, Einstein came along and proved that this was actually true. So he showed this with an experiment called the photoelectric effect. Actually, that's what he got the Nobel Prize for. So Einstein did not get a Nobel Prize for special relativity or general relativity or his equation that energy is mass, but for showing that the quantum world is real. And here the problem started, because the foundations of reality, we're looking at this now, turned out to be, that made like no sense. You have this, I mean, I'm sure many of you have heard of these quantum weirdness things, like wave, particle, it depends on how you look at it. It's this one thing, but then it's this other thing, but it somehow doesn't make sense, and it's all like probabilistic, and if you observe it, you kind of change it. So yeah, that's kind of how it started in 1905, that we realized that actually the structure of reality is very different to what kind of this classical, nicely mathematically thought out physics was. And what was the reaction of the physicist community? Shut up and calculate. So it was like, hey, we're physicists, we don't do philosophy, so just leave it, just do the math, do the equations. And we did that, and we have amazing technology because of that. This is what the math gives us. The math works. It tells us how the thing works, but not what it is. And that was kind of a big sort of blind spot, that a lot of physicists just never sort of thought that it's important to actually do philosophy. Actually, a lot of physicists think it's a waste of time, because it's like, how stupid, you have to like debate things and nothing is really kind of sure. So that kind of started there with, so kind of in 1905, where you actually had the pioneers of quantum physics. They were very open to kind of thinking of the world in a new way, that maybe consciousness is something more fundamental than we thought, and that maybe, reality is not what we thought it would be. But they kind of died, and the next generation just took over with the shut up and calculate, do the equations. Technology worked, and we had this amazing understanding of like the bits and parts, how they interact, and we forgot about like the bigger picture. Then we fast forward to 1994. So then another huge gap emerged. So it's kind of amazing that the academic study of consciousness wasn't really a thing till, I mean, even like in 1980, there was like sort of some philosophy handbooks that said, well, consciousness is like, everything's been written about it, there's nothing to, we've understood it, whatever, it's like, I don't even know what they defined it as, but it was like, yeah, come on, don't bother. We all know what it is, so let's leave it at that. In 1994, David Chalmers, a young philosopher, went on stage at a conference, and he posed the hard problem of consciousness, he called it. And his question was very simple, and it's actually an old question rephrased, but he kind of made it famous again, and he asked, how is it possible that non-conscious stuff comes together and suddenly becomes conscious? Like, how? Where does this pop out? How can we understand this? Because we all know it, because we have this first-person perspective. We look out into the world. We are this kind of matter that became conscious. So, what is this? How do you get from the universe that began without life and consciousness, as it seems, and suddenly developed it? Like, how did these steps in complexity and emergence kind of happen? And on a side note, we still don't even have a definition of consciousness today. So, like, the best definition we have that people use is, what does it feel like to be something? So this goes back to another philosopher called Thomas Nagel, who in 1974, whatever, wrote a book, What is it like to be a bat? And there he kind of asked the question, how would it feel, like this perspective, this first-person view, if you would be a bat? And this kind of has stuck as the best definition, which is still used today, is like, what does it like to be something? Like, how bad of a definition is that for something that's so fundamental and like is so important for all of us? And so what David Chalmers posed this question in what is called the philosophy of mind. So this is another interesting kind of distinction. So neuroscientists, they kind of try to figure out how our brain computes. Like, you put neurons together and they start to compute, and the energy it uses. But kind of the gap of explaining consciousness, they are like, yeah, it kind of happens somehow. It emerges from the brain, we don't know quite how, but at the moment we're like really sort of focused on understanding how the brain computes. That's what neuroscientists are doing today, and they're doing a great job in finding out like all these areas in the brain where things happen. But kind of like what consciousness is the domain of the philosophy of mind. So it's philosophers who are actually debating what the nature of consciousness is, and not academics or scientists, I should say. So that's kind of the state in 1994. And two answers came out of this. So how do you get conscious stuff from non-conscious stuff? Well, either consciousness is not what we think it is, or reality is not what we think it is. So these are the two options. And the first camp, these are like the philosophers of mind who think that kind of this materialistic, reductionistic metaphysics is correct. So they're like the sober people. They're like, it is what you see, and there's like no fancy things going on. So their explanation is to say, well, actually, consciousness is maybe not really a big deal. Maybe it's just an illusion. Maybe it's something we think we have, but we don't actually have. So to answer the hard problem, they say, well, consciousness doesn't really exist, so that solves the problem because there's no problem in the beginning. And this is called either illusionism or denialism. And there's many philosophers of mind today who are very active and are very convinced that this is the right explanation. And then you have the other camp who say, well, maybe reality is not what we think it is, and maybe consciousness is like the fundamental thing from which reality emerges from. So we've had this in philosophy called idealism, where people said, yeah, maybe consciousness is like all there is, and everything comes from consciousness. Like especially in Germany, there was kind of this phase of idealism with Kant and kind of like people thinking that, but somehow with history that kind of lost sort of its appeal. And now this is having kind of a renaissance, that people are reconsidering that this seems to be actually a really good way to explain the hard problem of consciousness, because then it's not like how does consciousness emerge from non-conscious stuff, because basically everything is an expression of consciousness. But I'm going to a bit more detail later on, because that's like the hard thing of understanding idealism rationally, because that somehow doesn't work so well. And it's kind of interesting that sort of to get us from illusionism to idealism, actually there was one or two neuroscientists who started to think, well, maybe consciousness is just like information that's like, if you put information, if you pack it very densely, it suddenly starts to have this inner perspective. And this is called the integrated information theory, and there's like two neuroscientists who proposed this. And basically this is saying that anything like your phone, if it's integrating enough and computing enough information, it should become conscious, which is panpsychism. So this is also an old kind of view that says everything has a little bit of consciousness. Like an electron has a little bit, a stone a bit more, our brains super much, but everything has a bit of consciousness. The problem is that panpsychism has kind of a couple of problems that philosophers can't really solve. And somehow it's like the first step out of the orthodoxy of like this materialistic worldview, because instead of saying everything has consciousness and it comes together and gives more, the idealist goes a step further, saying that actually everything that is material emerges from consciousness. And so this is like how these two camps started to diverge. And if you kind of read, like there's kind of books on where all these philosophers kind of like show their perspective and explain how stupid they find the perspective of the other people. So you have the illusionists who think that these idealists are just absolutely crazy, and vice versa, because it's like, it's just so far apart, it's crazy. It's like these are just two diametrically opposed views of consciousness and reality. So That's 1994. So where are we today? Well, physics got weirder. So all of the quantum stuff got even worse. Like a lot of physicists are now thinking that space and time are not fundamental, which is a big deal because somehow you think, well, I mean, obviously, like we know what reality is, and like saying consciousness is like a reality comes out of consciousness is like silly because we know what reality is, and turns out that maybe space and time is an emergent thing that comes out of entangled quantum information, whatever that is. But this is something which is coming out of like the cutting edge sort of quantum gravity research of people. So by saying that space and time are maybe not fundamental, I mean everything's open basically. There's like the restrictions to what reality can be are like reduced because now it's like this is an open field because if space and time are not fundamental, well, okay, then what else is maybe very different to what we thought? And we have this thing. So in quantum mechanics, if you the measurement problem, which has been there since over 100 years, if you measure something, you interact with it and you change it. Doesn't sound so bad, but like now the modern version is called contextuality, and these people who study these quantum phenomenon are now really sure that they say this. If you think of an electron and think it has properties which you measure, that's the wrong way to think of it. This electron has no properties. Depending on how and what you measure, the context, you put these properties there. So this is deep as well. Basically everything so the idea of an objective reality out there is totally wrong. I mean, this is quantum physicists telling us that reality is contextual. Depending on how you approach it, you get an answer. And assuming that the color or whatever the attribute is out there, our experiments show us this is not true. So science got weirder. Then what about complexity? So, I mean, us on Earth here, we're just embedded in crazy complexity everywhere. Life, our bodies, our consciousness, our society, everything we humans have done is like super complex. And how exactly do you get from like 4 fundamental laws to all this emerging complexity? And so there's some clues that we have, but basically something that's called complexity science, which kind of diverged a bit from physics, tries to kind of understand this from a very sort of different perspective than kind of physicists who would say, well, it kind of happened, that's the way it is, that's what the universe does, so what can we know? So something is driving complexity, obviously. I mean, which is kind of the antithesis of what physicists are saying, which is like the universe is going into more disorder. This is called entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, whatever, that the universe it's going into chaos. Well, yes, but it's going into chaos while on the other side, all these complex structures self-organize and emerge. So there's a part of the story that we've missed in like why we see all this complexity. So just to summarize, our sciences they're having a tough time because there's a lot of stuff which we've now realized that we don't understand, and we've tried to like ignore it or just sweep it under the carpet, but yeah, it just won't go away. And also what we now have today, which is amazing, is called the philosophy of psychedelics. So since the psychedelic renaissance around 2016, where it's like suddenly, oh, maybe these psychedelic substances shouldn't be forbidden everywhere or like demonized, because it turns out they have big value in treating people with mental health issues. So like, big discovery, although we actually knew it already in the 70s, before then the war on drugs and everything got prohibited. And now we have philosophers of psychedelics, and like one philosopher of psychedelics was saying, well, if you study the philosophy of mind, like how can you not take psychedelics and like talk about this? It's like if you have a band and you take away their instruments, like how can they make music? Like how can a philosopher of mind talk about or do philosophy without actually accessing these different states of being? So suddenly from something which was like stigmatized has become something which is like very relevant for people who are doing this research. Of course, not everyone agrees. Then you have philosophers of science, philosophers of psychedelics who say, yes, psychedelics do help people with mental health issues, but at the cost of giving you very weird metaphysical ideas like idealism. So we'll get to that later. So what we're kind of talking about here is like the tension between science, which talks in the third person perspective. Science is always, it has nothing to do with humans or kind of life. It's always seen from the outside. It's always like in the third person. It's always very detached. And the other thing is our first person perspective, which is us, which we experience every day. And these two have not been able to kind of be merged. And this is kind of the conflict we're seeing now in our science and philosophy, that our assumptions on both sides somehow don't allow these two things to merge together. And as I kind of mentioned, that this kind of, with this philosophy of mind, this renaissance of idealism came back, and again it's based on this first person perspective. And then it turns out that actually we have a huge history of psychedelics which we in the West kind of just tended to ignore, from the earliest Vedas in Hinduism, which had this psychedelic potion they kind of revered as a god, from the Greeks, kind of basically the foundations of Greek philosophy, which is like our thing kind of thinking, our Western perspective, is founded on psychedelics. So Plato was, I mean, they like in Athens at the time, like every year they had this huge celebration where they took this psychedelic potion, which we don't really know what it is, but we know it was super psychedelic. And that's kind of like a thing in our history, and we never talk about this. I've never heard this being said in like a philosophy class, that basically what Plato was saying, like the cave analogy, is kind of maybe something he like experienced firsthand. It's something he like saw when he was in a different state of mind. And so we've had this blind spot where we kind of ignored psychedelics and also the history, and this is now coming back. And so kind of from this first person perspective, we have many people, or we have many reports of people who've been kind of traveling with their consciousness to these other layers of reality which idealism speaks of. And these are shamans, mystics, meditators, and psychonauts. So shamans were basically the first, I mean, this was like the first religion, and it was very centered around these kind of transitioning to the spirit world, kind of this non-physical realm of existence. And a lot of it is like with psychedelic plants. I mean, all this knowledge in the Amazon of shamans for healing, they also had this huge knowledge of like all these different psychedelic plants, how to mix them. Like you have to take this bush and that tree and put it together for 6 hours, and then you get ayahuasca. Like, how do you like find this with like, I think whatever estimated 60,000 species of plants and trees there? So they had this intimate knowledge of like how to travel into, or like how to kind of travel with your consciousness into other non-physical dimensions. And also the mystics. So there's a big tradition, I mean, in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism, where these mystics were saying, hey, this God thing we're talking about, you can experience that. This is something this isn't something out there, and like God is kind of this judging whatever figure out there, but it's actually the thing you experience, which, I mean, all these mystics were like super inspired and inspiring to like a lot of people. But of course, in the context of religion, it's like easy to institutionalize this and sort of use it as a power structure. So mysticism isn't really encouraged in that sense. And they seem to have had that like spontaneously, like these people just whatever sitting in the forest and like, wow, whatever, kind of having insights into this like higher dimension of reality. And the meditators, so it kind of turns out that sort of if you meditate for long enough and kind of try and go to the very basis of like if you take a microscope and try and zoom into like no matter the smallest part, what at one point it just stops because it becomes weird in quantum mechanics and stuff. If you try and do the same with meditation, then at one point you sort of like pop out the other side and kind of end up in this field of consciousness, kind of, which is what idealism says is there. Kind of this is also again experienceable. And then we have a lot of reports of psychonauts who have like traveled very deeply into this transcendental realm of reality. Like Christopher Bache, he was a philosopher of religion, and for 20 years he took 73 high-dose LSD doses, and he wrote the book called LSD in the Mind of the Universe, like 30 years later, because it took him like 10 years to recover from the 20 years, because he just went so deep into this, like, into the fabric of reality, and the kind of like the metaphysical things he writes is just like mind-blowing, and just kind of aligns also with kind of this, what these shamans have been saying, and what seems to lie behind this physical realm we're seeing here. And I mean, it's crazy, like, I mean, this is like now the part where this becomes interesting, because everything we try and sort of understand is with our mind rationally. So idealism, well, idealism means that there's this non-physical, transpersonal, blah 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 field of consciousness. What does that mean? How? That's why it kind of has a hard standing in the philosophy of mind, because it's just like so weird to grasp, but it's like super easy to experience, like really easy. If you don't believe it, you can just 5 hits of DMT in a pipe, and your consciousness just gets projected into this other realm, which is stable, which has features a lot of people, or all these people report from. And so like one thing is that it just feels real, more real than this here, which, so I've never taken DMT, so I don't know what that means, but I can like imagine like how insane an experience must be that you say, well, this was more real than what I'm experiencing now here in my sober reality. And you stay there like 10 minutes in physical time, but because you're outside of space and time, literally, it feels like it can be like forever. And you have the feeling that you're interacting with other conscious beings there. That's what every DMT user's ever said, ever. So this means that we're kind of shifting from knowing things theoretically to knowing things experientially. So this is like a huge shift in knowledge. Like, what does knowledge mean? Well, no, knowledge is only relevant if you can think about it rationally. Well, apparently in quantum physics tells us rationality, common sense, and logic are not things reality is bothered about at a fundamental level. These are all human constructs. We think they're important, they're great, they're good tools, but kind of our idea that this is something we should expect to see in reality is like totally wrong, because I mean, we know this from quantum physics, that reality is not logical at the fundamental level. And so now we have something which we can experience ourselves and kind of if we want to, or we can read about people who have done this, and then we can see if we disagree or not. But basically, if you disagree, you have to go there and see for yourself. So,
and then you won't disagree.
well, or yeah, I mean that's kind of interesting. That's the question. But usually, a lot of the psychonauts seem to agree on what they're seeing there. And again, these are like, again, it's like hard to talk about because these are all concepts which somehow don't relate to anything you've ever experienced during your sober life. So these people come back from the 10 minutes of DMT and they're like, their mind is blown and they're like struggling to find concepts and words to explain what was happening. So I don't know, there was this bestseller by the author Michael Pollan called How to Change Your Mind, which was also a part of like sort of the psychedelic renaissance. And he has this crazy DMT experience where he describes how reality just deconstructs and there was just nothingness, but he was still somehow there observing, although there was nothing. And I mean, he's an author, so he really like, he really gives you a good feeling of like what this felt like, but then he says, the words I'm writing here just do not give any justice to what was happening there. I'm just grasping at like straws. So we're dealing with something that we have a hard time to sort of intellectually connect with. And as we do not have the culture like shamans or whatever more Eastern cultures have with meditation, for us this is like totally alien. And so for a lot of people it's like, this is bullshit, whatever, this can't be true. So we're seeing glimpses of like what this new sort of worldview is doing and is happening also in science. So like the newer generation, some of the scientists of the newer generation, they realize that this has been a problem for long, and maybe to address the issues we need to rethink things. So like one person is he's called Müller, whatever, so Müller, Markus Müller, but he works with Zeilinger, who won the Nobel Prize last year for quantum information stuff, and his thing is like constructing a whole quantum mechanics from a first-person perspective. Whoa, like crazy. So he's like really trying to bring this exactly kind of this subject, not subjectivity, but just this shift of perspective from the third person to the first person, and he constructs kind of this model theory which kind of like a structured world with laws just pops out, and so cool, this kind of works. I mean, this isn't like, I mean, it's just a toy model, but it works, and like physicists are tinkering with these new ideas. So this is like cool that we are witnessing a paradigm shift. So things are changing, but not too obvious. And like another interesting person is Erwin Laszlo. So he was like a pioneering complexity scientist. He's like over 80 now, and like a couple of years ago he said that there exists an intelligence behind the things that exist in the universe, and there is purpose exhibited by this intelligence, and it is humanly possible to access some elements of this intelligence. So full-on idealism and full-on that this kind of field of consciousness behind things. This isn't like random or just doing nothing. This has purpose, which is like, or has been a big red flag for science, because science was very clear. The universe is random. The universe has no purpose. And if you think you see purpose, it's because you're deluded and you're projecting. So there is no way that the universe has any purpose or is doing anything but just being random and just things are happening because they happen and that's it. So this is like a really big shift in kind of our metaphysical view, that we can consider that, okay, there's like somehow maybe there's like more to the laws of physics than we've seen, like structuring laws, like the complexity we're seeing around us seems to be something which is encoded in the laws of the universe. We haven't seen it directly, we don't know where it is, but we see it happening around us. So maybe slowly these blind spots are kind of being discovered for what they are, and we're slowly, with our scientists being able to sort of access kind of this new worldview where we kind of like scientists realize that we need to have philosophy. We really have to be more sort of holistic in our cognitive capacities. You can't just be like, no, I just want to focus on the equations. That, yeah, we've been doing that for whatever, 80, 90 years, so that doesn't work anymore. And so the question now is like, how does this continue? Because so a bit of the problem with idealism is that the people who are proposing like different versions of it today, and there's like a bunch of people who are doing that, they all kind of have this sort of different version. So there's like different perspectives on it. And this is kind of maybe also a reason why it hasn't become like too much mainstream, because it's like a bit fragmented. And that's actually so something I tried to do with the book is sort of to get these perspectives together and like see what was actually common in all of them, and like try and sort of give an overall sort of view of what this new thing can be. And kind of what I found was like there's a couple of elements, and one is just like, okay, we kind of, ontology is the word philosophers use to describe the structure of reality. And so we have an ontology that has two levels. We have our kind of this physical universe thing, but then we have this field of this non-physical, non-personal field of intelligence below it, which is creating this thing around us. And maybe we should think of the reality we're living in here more of like a projection or a simulation or a computation than as kind of a real thing of itself, and it's kind of being projected out of this lower source reality. And kind of an important part is like, it's a bit technical, and that's like what's happening at the interface of quantum mechanics, that you have like these waves or kind of bubbles of like potentiality. Like you never know where the electron is. It's just like this probabilistic space, and then suddenly you measure it, and the electron is here. So kind of this transition from the potential to the actual, that seems to be something which is kind of part of kind of this metaphysics, where again going back to like pioneers of quantum mechanics who really thought about this deeply, and this seemed to be a bit forgotten or kind of not thought it was kind of relevant. And then kind of this will to complexity. So Arthur Schopenhauer said there's like a will behind things, like everything that happens is because of the will which is inherent in all things. And then Nietzsche came and said, well, it's the will to power, but somehow it seems to be that there's like the will to complexity. The universe wants to become more complex. That's kind of where it's going to. It's by kind of descending into overall into more chaos and disorder, kind of, at least what we're seeing here on Earth, this pocket of complexity and structure is becoming crazier and crazier. I mean, we had life first, which was like this amazing program, and then on top of life, consciousness emerged. And then on top of this, we started to program computers that are now doing computations. So this seems to be something inherent that's happening in the universe, that's like, it's happening through us, and we're part of this process, and we haven't seen it yet, or kind of pointed a finger towards it, but this is happening. And I mean, we know some of the kind of the mechanisms, and it is like with entropy, and it makes kind of sense that somehow you have kind of the, by sort of going into disorder, you can create pockets of order which get more and more structured. That's one of the things which are like non-thermodynamic, non-equilibrium thermodynamics, blah blah blah, would be like what sort of the physicists who are doing this are figuring out how these things actually happen in detail. And kind of an interesting thing which I really liked from one philosopher of mind called Bernardo Kastrup. His background is computer science, and he was like a computer scientist working at CERN, whatever. And he switched to philosophy of mind, and he became like a big spokesperson for idealism. And he was saying that basically what's happening is you have this field of consciousness which is like non-structured, and within this you can have like sort of fields of awareness which are kind of our centers of sort of perception and awareness. And he compares it to the DID it's called. It's kind of it's people who have multiple personalities, where it switches. Dissociated identity disorder it's called. And this is actually a thing, and you can like measure it, that there's like different brain activity depending on what alter they're called is currently like in the driving seat. And he's kind of like asking us to think in a way that that's what's kind of happening with our consciousness, that basically you have this overall thing, but then you have these kind of little organizational pockets of consciousness which sort of come together and think like, oh yeah, I'm kind of an individual, I'm not kind of part of the field of consciousness. And which kind of means that sort of you have the field of consciousness here, you have reality emerging out of it, it's becoming more and more complex, and somehow when you reach kind of human brains, you're able to like channel aspects of the fundamental like consciousness level up here. That seems to be what's happening, and that's like, so the question of free will, every scientist tells you free will cannot exist because it would mean that that's an additional force, and we know there's only four, so there's no way there can be like free will, because that would mean that from nowhere this is coming. Well, if it's coming from the source reality, then it would be like a new causal layer on top of the four forces we have, and free will is a real thing. So that kind of seems to make more sense than saying that actually everything you do is predetermined and like, yeah, there's nothing to it, so you're not in control, which is, yeah, kind of super weirdly counterintuitive and seems just very wrong. And kind of where this is all going to is like ever more complexity, and somehow like the Christopher Bache, the LSD guy, he was saying that kind of what seems to be happening is that we're trying to prepare like the physical world, that we can channel more and more of kind of this consciousness into, so that more of the fundamental consciousness field gets channeled into the contingent and material. That's kind of like where it's going to. That's kind of the purpose and the aim, that kind of the evolution of the universe is going to, that there's like more and more higher levels of consciousness that should sort of feed in. And I don't know, kind of things like telepathy make absolute sense as like a next evolutionary step of consciousness in kind of this realm of physical space and time. And that's it.
Internal temperature high.